Hello and welcome to a new episode of OTT Talks. I'm Andrea Bertel and I coordinate the On Think Tanks program at OTT. OTT Talks is a series of friendly conversations with thought leaders and practitioners in the field of evidence-informed policymaking and the think tank sector. In today's episode, we continue with our Candid Talk about funding series, exploring the crucial role of program officers and getting to know the people who fill these positions. And to help us further unpack this topic is Dana Schmidt, Program Director at the Echidna Giving, a philanthropic fund that joins with critical thinkers, innovators, and practitioners to advance girls' education in the developing world. In this role, Dana leads the grant-making strategy on early childhood development and co-lead grant-making on adolescent skills and mindsets. Before joining Echidna in 2016, Dana was a program officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundations, where she helped to develop and run a 10-year, 125 million grant-making initiative to improve the quality of education that children receive in the developing world. Welcome, Dana. I'm very happy that you're here with us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Right, let's get right into the questions then. How would you describe the role of a program officer? What are your key tasks and functions?
Yeah, so I think of the role of a program officer as sort of three core responsibilities. The first is to really help set a grant-making strategy for the work of the foundation. And so that's really kind of working to understand where we can best influence the wider field for impact, and kind of setting the parameters for how grant decisions will be made. So that's kind of the first core function. The second is to really find, fund, and support organizations who are advancing that strategy. So I think this is probably in many ways, the heart and soul of being a program officer is figuring out who are great organizations to grant make to that are hopefully helping to advance change in the world along the lines of that grant making strategy. And then the third piece is to really learn from those grants that we make and from the wider field in order to, I think, one, influence future strategy, right? So to feed back into that first function of setting strategy, to feed into the second function of really supporting organizations in the best way possible. And also to, in some ways, I think, and this varies from one organization to the next, how much directly program officers are involved in influencing decisions and perhaps playing kind of a direct role in that in some instances. I think in my case, it's more around hopefully influencing other funders through what we're learning to sort of come alongside us and help support some of the impact we're trying to have. So setting the grant making strategy, finding funding and supporting organizations, and learning from the wider field and influencing the wider field as well. Okay. I think are the three.
I have a couple of follow-up questions of that. You mentioned the first one is setting the grant-making strategy. How do you go about that? Who do you work with? How do you consult? How long is that cycle? How does that work?
Yeah, so I'm a strong believer that many foundations set strategies that are much too short. So I think kind of the minimum period for a grant-making strategy should be 7 years at minimum. And you see many foundations setting strategies 3 or 4 years long. I think that's not very realistic because once you fix a grant making strategy, often it takes a while to sort of find the grantee partners who to fund in that area. That could take a year to do that. It often takes grantee partners a while to get up and running. That's another year. You're already 2 years into your 3-year strategy before the work has really even started in a serious way, let alone, leaving time for grantees to really pursue work, iterate, learn, adjust, and learn from that. And so I think, a 7-year minimum strategy period is really critical. In terms of kind of process for that, we have, I think there's lots of different inputs that we gather as we set our strategy. So one is just understanding kind of the current state of literature and, in my case, in the field of girls' education, what do we understand about what's working, what's not, and what we don't yet know. One is talking to others in the field, grantee partners being a key part of that, and other experts in the field to understand their sense of where some key gaps are. And then there's also, the actual interaction with those key decision makers within the foundation and what their passions and interests are as well, and really figuring out how can you kind of find where there's a really important something in the world that needs to happen that grant making could potentially actually influence, and how that aligns with the passion and interests of the governing body for the foundation, and really, finding that intersection to set the strategy.
And usually, how long does this process take? Because you mentioned that it should be a 7-year cycle from the moment that the strategy has been launched. How long does it take to prepare the strategy? So when in the cycle of the 7 years, you start beginning to prepare for the next cycle?
Yeah. So I think it can vary. I think it's a delicate balance between allowing enough time to be thoughtful about it and not allowing so much time that you get bogged down in strategy, which I think many of us have experienced in that as well. So, but I think at probably realistically, kind of starting reflection and, if you're coming, when I started at Echidna, I helped develop our very first strategy. So we're still in our first strategy cycle, I should say. But, from experience at the Hewlett Foundation, I would say it takes, at least 9 months, if not a bit longer, if you're doing it in alongside, other grant making priorities, right? And so it's kind of, you continue on your existing strategy while doing a little bit of, retrospective, refreshing, understanding kind of what has worked in the existing strategy, talking to others, etc. I think if we could do it even faster, I think it would be better. But I think realistically, given the number of stakeholders involved, sometimes it can take a longer time period if you don't want to hit pause on other priorities.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I got something interesting about what you mentioned as well on the learning strand of your work. So you learn to influence future strategies, you learn to influence and to support the funders, but you also learn to influence other funders. So on the questions of influence, what you think, what is your role, but also what do you think is the role of foundations in general to influence policy and practice? I know that you work through your grantees usually for that, but is there any strand of that work that you do, or what do you think about that, if that should be done or not?
So it's a great question. We at Echidna Giving do not work directly to influence policy and practice. We fund partners who are better positioned to do that than a set of individuals sitting in San Francisco, California, very far from many of the countries in which our grantee partners are working, right? So they're much better positioned to do that work, I think. On the flip side, I think among funders, in many ways, as a fellow funder, we have the privilege of being in conversations and circles and having influence over other funders in a way that grantee partners do not, right? So I think we see more of a role for influence among peer funders than among, governments in countries in which we do not live or vote, right? So I think other institutions are structured differently, perhaps have staff in those countries who have different positions and levels of credibility and even more of a right, I guess I would say, to kind of play a role in influence. And I think in those instances, I think there's a different set of opportunities available. But I think it really depends on the position of a funder and its staff, what level of influence is appropriate, I suppose.
Great, thanks. And following with the functions, what do you think is the skill sets that's required to do this role well?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and obviously there are many, as with any job. I think one is really just the ability to absorb information. As a funder, you sit very much with a bird's eye perspective on the field. So being able to kind of understand how the pieces interact and add up and make connections across different sources of information that you have access to is certainly one key piece A second key piece is being able to really assess organizations and their capabilities and be able to make a judgment about whether an organization is going to be effective at pursuing the change that they want to pursue. But I also think there's an awful lot about being a funder that involves, I don't know if this is a skill set per se, but navigating kind of gray spaces, and being able to sort of live with the fact that there's not things aren't always black and white. You're often balancing across sort of competing values almost that are important. So to give an example, one of the key values, I suppose, is to be a good steward of resources, right? To make good decisions about where the dollars go so that they are being used towards affecting social change. And I think that sort of desire to really make the most effective use of scarce resources means that you have kind of this impulse to say, let's do lots of due diligence before making a grant. Let's really try to make sure that we understand the ins and outs of how this organization works and what they're trying to do. And do we, how effective have they been historically? What do other people think? And gathering a lot of input to make the best decision possible about that potential grant. But on the flip side, as much as you value effective use of resources, I think also a value of efficiency and a sense of urgency to address really critical problems, and a sense of the need to respect grantees' time, which is a valuable resource in and of itself, right? And that pushes you more in the direction of making quicker decisions, not asking too many questions of organizations, not taking too long to actually decide whether or not to make a grant. And so I think one huge skill set for program officers is really threading the needle between different priorities and being able to sort of make sound judgments about, how to balance between different priorities. And then the last thing I would say that you have to be really good at as a program officer is letting go, because I think ultimately most of the work, not that program officers don't work hard, but the actual work to advance social change is mostly happening by grantees, and you have to be comfortable with them taking the lead and with them getting the credit and sort of being the behind the scenes support for their success. And so I think, for some personalities that can be really hard, right? If you're used to being a doer, moving into this role of supporter, I think can be a challenge. It's an important part of the job.
That's a good description of being a supporter of others doing. And I really also like this, what you mentioned on being good at making judgments about which organizations would work and which ones would not work. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, what gives you that hunch? What gives you the ability to thread the needle? What is flexibility you speak about? I know it's a juggling act, but anything that you can say about that?
Yeah, I suppose in some ways it's, part of and we may get to some of these themes later on, part of what makes the job particularly difficult is because it is ultimately quite subjective. And so, some of it is built on experience working with organizations and getting a feel for, how effective leadership tends to present itself. And other things that ultimately also, are very subjective and subject to all kinds of bias that are problematic, right? And so on the one hand, it would be great if you could really pin this down as a science and say, if you hit these 5 criteria, it's very likely to be successful, and that you could objectively assess those criteria and make a decision. I think I don't think it's that easy. I wish it were. I hope if others are out there and feel like they have made it into a science that can correct me, it'd be great. So I think the pieces that I tend to look for are, one, is the organization able to clearly articulate what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it, and why they think the way they're doing it is likely to succeed. And just, having a clear sense of where you're trying to go and how you're trying to get there, I think is really critical. So then the second piece, though, is, does the organization sort of have are they set up and have the people that they need to kind of carry out the work as they envision it, but also to sort of consistently be learning about what is and isn't working and adjusting as they go. So do they have kind of this a mindset towards iterating and learning and shifting their approach in response to what they find out? And do they have the staff that is required to make that happen? And do they otherwise have, sort of the governance, the people and the resources they need to carry out the work that they envision for themselves? And I think, like I said, a lot of that ends up being quite subjective. But I think you can get a sense of, how leaders talk about the work that they do, what sort of questions are they asking, that can give you clues as to, do they have this learning mindset around their work? Are they able to speak about what they've learned with some depth, etc. So I don't know how well that answers your question, but
that's great. So it's articulate, people having the people needed to do to adjust and to learn as they go along, and then the final one. Let me ask just one follow-up questions on this, and then we'll move on to the next one. You mentioned governance as something that you look for, but governance, I find it's a kind of an elusive term. It's used by so many people in so many different ways, meaning so many different things. So, what is it that what part of aspect of governance do you take into account?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think it is a tricky one. But I think, is there strong leadership in place? Is there a board to which that leadership is accountable? And does that board have some level of sort of separation from the leadership? Is it, a set of objective as you can get, individuals who are, helping to oversee the work within the organization? I think that those are the key things that I would look for.
Great, thanks. That was very clear. Now, moving to another question, a more personal one, perhaps. You've been in this role for quite a while, and can you share how you entered this field and what led you to pursue this career path?
Yeah, so I entered this field right out of graduate school, actually, which is, I think, on the very young end of the spectrum in philanthropy, and actually, I guess 2 years prior to starting my career in philanthropy, had no idea what philanthropy was. I actually, as an undergrad, someone said, "Oh, hey, there's this course on philanthropy that you would really like." They knew I was interested in education internationally and, kind of supporting nonprofits. And they said, "You really like this course on philanthropy." And I was kind of like, "What is philanthropy?" I had no idea. And so I looked at, I checked it out, I took the course, and I was like, "Oh, this is really interesting," because I was interested in education, in international development, and also very cognizant that, given my positionality, it wasn't necessarily me that would be the best place to actually go out and run programs in the areas I was interested in. And so I was very interested in philanthropy as a space through which I could support leaders who were much closer to some of the problems I really cared about, and really in a much better position to decide what to do about them and give them resources to do that. So I took this course, and then ultimately ended up applying for a fellowship that gave me paid for me to work for a foundation for a year after graduating. And ended up at the Hewlett Foundation for that fellowship, and then stuck around. So that's how and why I entered this field that I previously knew nothing about, and still, you're meeting new people there, and they ask what you do. It's still often very hard to describe because I think it's not a very well-known space.
Yes, we get that in the think tank world as well. And what is a think tank? What is all these roles are very difficult to explain. So that's why we are holding these sort of sessions, to be able to share what's the role, for people to understand more what is the role as a PO. And then going to another issue, how would you describe the level of impact and contribution that program officers make? You can talk with your role of Echidna, or thinking at your time in Hewlett as well, or just in general.
Yeah, so obviously one big piece that I touched on in sort of talking through what the key aspects of a program officer's job is. One huge piece is making funding decisions. So often a program officer is not the final arbiter or final decision maker. There's usually kind of a board approval process at play, but the program officer is the one making recommendations to the board and has tremendous influence over what goes to the board and how that gets framed and who ultimately gets allocated resources. So that's one, huge piece. I suppose the other piece that I think is probably equally important and maybe less talked about than it should be is that program officers have a huge influence over a grantee's experience in terms of, what type of support and how they feel a foundation shows up to support their work, which I think has a ripple effect on that organization's ability to really operate effectively. And so I think as much as kind of the influence about who gets funded is important, I think the influence over how that funding and other support is offered to organizations is really important. And the Center for Effective Philanthropy, which does provide lots of supports, including kind of helps foundations run surveys, anonymous surveys of grantees to understand their experience working with a given funder, finds that there's individual program officers within the same foundation that grantees have different perceptions of individual program officers operating within the same foundation, which suggests that program officers have a huge influence over what a grantee's experience is, even if they're operating in the same institutional constraints as peers. And so I think, really thinking about, not just who gets the funding, but how that's provided, what level of flexibility you're giving organizations, what level of ownership they have over the work that they're doing, et cetera, is really important. And I think, we're often, almost every foundation I can think of has a tagline that talks somehow about, making the world better, empowering people, providing greater opportunity for people, advancing justice, et cetera, right? We have these taglines that talk about wanting to empower others and make positive change. And I think thinking about how we do that in the way that we show up in relationship with grantees is, a really critical piece of that, broader change that we hope to engender.
And keeping with the impact as well, what do you hope changes in the world, or do you have any expectations about what you can contribute to the world with this work? I know that's a difficult question, because how much change can one person do, but why are you doing this?
Yeah,
I think that would be the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a good question. It's a hard one because often we're working on really, really big problems, and as much as it feels like, you're granting $25 million a year, that feels huge. It's such a tiny drop in the bucket relative to what governments are putting into education on an annual basis, for example. But I guess I hope that the funding we're providing helps us in the case of Echidna Giving, inch towards greater access to higher quality education and greater gender equity in that access to education. As you said in my intro, I was at the Hewlett Foundation before Echidna Giving. I was there for 10 years. And some of the things that we funded when I was at the Hewlett Foundation, I'm now kind of 7 years later seeing the fruits bear from those investments. And so I think one of the challenges of this is also can be a very long time horizon to see changes. But I do think, I've seen over the course of my career, shifts in the way in which priorities are framed by governments and intergovernmental bodies. So, just to give one example, when I started at the Hewlett Foundation, we were still operating under the Millennium Development Goals, which framed education purely in terms of whether or not children were attending school. And just before I left the Hewlett Foundation, the Sustainable Development Goals were born, and within that, education goals changed quite a bit to be much more focused on not just whether or not children are in school, but whether or not they were learning what they needed to know to be successful. And so I think, and I think that some of the investments we made were part of that shift. By no means were they all of it, though, right? We're definitely talking about contribution, not attribution for a lot of the change that you see in the work that you do. So at any rate, I do think kind of inching towards some of these big, hairy, audacious goals that we have around seeing better, higher quality education access for more people is one thing that I hope to see as a result, but also am humble about how much we can contribute to that and how quickly we'll see some of those changes. But I think the other piece that I hold in my head too is just building a more vibrant ecosystem of organizations who are working on these issues that we really care about and who are situated close to the problems they're trying to solve. Because as much as we want to see progress towards better outcomes, I think we also want to see that there are organizations out there who are well placed to continue really tackling those problems and iterating on their approaches, as I touched on earlier. And I think that's something very tangible that funders can do, right? Is really to kind of build that institutional strength and ensure these organizations are out there really kind of plugging away on these issues over the long run.
Great. And those are great insights. And there's some follow-up on that. So working together, I think is coming up as a thread here. You've mentioned funders, but also grantees. How do you work together? Because change is systemic. There's different people that influence not only at the ground level, but with the funders that you're working with. How do you work together with other funders, and how do you support grantees and others in the field to work together? Is it done on a country level or regional level? Networks? How does that work?
I suppose all of the above in some ways to answer your question. So we participate in various funder networks. There's an international education funders group that we participate in and engage with other funders in. There's an early childhood funders group that we engage in for some of the work we do around preschool and pre-primary education work. So there are various funder networks that we engage in. We do a lot of work to sort of individually connect grantees where we see threads of commonality across them, and then in some instances where we also see kind of greater opportunities for collective work, we fund those organizations additionally to make that collective work happen. So to give an example there, we have funded in East Africa a collaborative around life skills, and a similar collaborative in India around life skills, which is a space that is rather nebulous. I mean, when you say life skills, lots of different organizations will define it very differently and will measure it very differently, et cetera. And that becomes a challenge when it comes to how do you then influence government around embedding life skills within their education systems, right? If it's unclear what those skills are and how you measure them. And so we saw an opportunity for organizations who are really working in those spaces to come together and jointly define some of the key skills that they see as critical for embedding within school systems, and to jointly develop relevant, contextually relevant ways to measure those skills. So there, instances where we come in and say, how can we actually provide the resources that enable this collaboration to happen, which goes much beyond just organizations connecting one-on-one. And similarly, I would say there are a few areas at the funder level where we have come in to say, how do we provide some resources and leadership to help funders really come together and make new things happen. And so one example there is we did an analysis of our portfolio several years ago that looking to see how many of our grants were going to organizations that were really led by and based in the countries in which they were doing their work. And we found that a lot of when we sliced and diced the data, that our research oriented grant making was particularly heavily going to global north organizations. And so we really wanted to kind of shift that, and we knew, as you probably know from all of your work with think tanks, that this is not sort of like a quick, just build institute, just make a few grants, but it was, how do we channel more resources into African education research, led by Africans, and felt like that was something that was going to require more funders than just ourselves. And so partnered actually with On Think Tanks to run a forum last year to look to engage African education researchers around what do they see as some of the barriers and obstacles to more education research happening from the continent, and have since kind of developed what are some of the key principles, brought other funders around those to say, how can we kind of advance this together? So I think there are, issues that we where we really care about it, kind of actually funding that collaborative work more intentionally.
Great, thanks. And for those of you listening who want to read more about this, there's a blog post by Enrique on the Global North, Global South, and how research funds are allocated. And now continue on the questions. One final question on this. When working with grantees on the level, like for example, on the life skills or others, is it usually initiated by you, this kind of push to collaborate, or does it come from grantees? How do you see that balance?
So this is another one of the sort of thread the needle things that I alluded to earlier, because on the one hand, it's very much the case that collaboration will not be successful unless there's a real demand for it from those who are collaborating. It is not an easy thing to do. It requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of willingness to navigate tricky negotiations across organizations, et cetera. And so those who are a part of the collaboration really have to be all in and see that there's that it's in their interest and that they'll achieve more together than they would individually. On the other hand, it's also the case that individual organizations don't always have the perspective that a funder has of where there might be intersections and opportunities to really achieve more together than they could individually. And so, in the case of the life skills work, for example, part of what we did was, I think we sort of saw that there were potential opportunities, and then it was a matter of being very careful about not saying this must happen, but about funding the possibility that it could happen, funding some early kind of research that engaged folks to see if it had traction, and funding enough time and trust building across organizations to see if it was worth pursuing further. And so I think it takes kind of yes, maybe seeing some ideas, but bringing them to the community in a way that they really have final decision-making power and ownership over whether it's a yes or a no, worthwhile collaboration.
Great, thanks. I really like this response on funders having this bird's eye view of who's doing what. And then moving on to another question, and going back to the impact of your decisions on resource allocation and the lives of people. How does this role affect you on a personal level?
I think that being a program officer, you really live with sort of a lot of sort of existential angst, or it's easy to have a lot of existential angst, and kind of there's a lot of dichotomy. So I think on the one hand, you can feel like a lot of angst about your enormous influence over where a lot of money gets invested, and go down the rabbit hole of, what right do I actually have to direct these resources? And on the other hand, I think you can also go down the rabbit hole of, gosh, what am I actually doing? Like, I don't do anything. Ultimately, it's the organizations I fund who are doing things, or often, they're, empowering teachers who are the ones who are actually changing the lives of children, or, that you're just multiple links away from some of the actual change that you want to see happen. And it can feel like you're sort of, at best, a small cog in a very large machine. And so I don't know, I think you kind of live with that duality of, like, on the one hand, sort of angst around what your right is to be there, and on the other hand, angst around whether you actually make a difference in any way at all. And so I guess it's a little bit of how it affects me. I think I've been plagued by those sort of doubts, both sides of the equation. And I think ultimately, I guess the way where I land is in really focusing in on how I engage and show up with my grantees and in support of them, and how, can I, if I can build meaningful relationships with them, if I can show up in supportive ways, I think that's one way to, I think both that's, personally fulfilling, and hopefully is a way to kind of ripple outwards towards, some of the broader changes that we want to see. But yeah, I do think it is a strange position to be in.
I really like this, the anxiety of the role, and the difficulties of being one step or 2 or 3 steps removed from the actual work. It makes it harder, definitely, to feel your direct impact. And on that, on being one step removed, and what you were mentioning before about grantees. So there's always power asymmetries between funders and grantees, and this having a bird's eye view and control over resources makes relationships difficult, or a bit more, difficult to manage. What dynamics do you notice in interaction with grantees versus other funders, and what has been difficult to lead, to work with, and what is easy, or what do you find works to do away with this power symmetries and have a balanced relationship, and what makes relationships harder?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest parts of the role, is navigating these power asymmetries. And I think you can, it's easy to fall in one of 2 traps. One trap that's easy to fall into is thinking that because of the power asymmetries, you must know everything, because people treat you as if you are, a very important person who has very good ideas. And I think, one trap to fall into is just, believing all of that. I think the other trap that you can fall into is actually kind of the opposite, knowing that people are perceiving you and treating you in that way, feeling like, oh my, having a lot of imposter syndrome, and feeling like, actually I don't really know anything. And so, yeah, so kind of trying to be steady and not let it go to your head, but also not let it make you question everything that you do, is something to navigate. And I think also there are lots of power dynamics at play, right? There's the fact that you hold kind of the power of the purse, and grantees don't. Layered on top of that are kind of power asymmetries that have to do with race and colonialism and gender dynamics and all of that. And so it is a lot to try to sort through. And I don't think I have any perfect answers, but I guess a few things that I try to do. So one, I often will name the dynamic in conversations with organizations. So, one of the things that's challenging is, I think sometimes as a funder, you can pose a question and an organization you're talking to can think, oh, that's what you want me to do. It's like, perceive it as a leading question, or, and kind of be tempted to go in that direction. So sometimes I just, caveat what I say with, look, I'm not, I know that, that because I'm the funder, sometimes what I say can be viewed as kind of an agenda for what I think you should do. This is but this is a genuine question, or, sometimes kind of just naming what the dynamic is can be helpful. I think the other piece is, really just, it comes to kind of the fundamentals of building relationships, right? And so showing up with a lot of curiosity, doing a lot more listening than speaking in conversations, trying to build strong connections, so that people feel like they can trust me as a person, and not just as, and not just think of kind of the power I hold. I think the other piece is, being open about sharing my own failures and or sharing what other grantees are struggling with, to just normalize that, it's okay to be transparent about what is and isn't working. Because I think that's one of the ways this power dynamic shows up, is that it can be really hard to get to learn about what is and isn't working if organizations are scared to name failures or name what they're struggling with. And so just really kind of normalizing that in conversations by sharing my own failures or other failures of other grantees, and inviting that kind of conversation regularly, I suppose. But it's a super tricky space to navigate, and I think it's especially tricky because you're often working against bad practices of other people in the sector, right? And so if other funders are punitive towards organizations for sharing failure, that's going to make them that much less likely to be transparent in their relationships with you. So we see that. I see that showing up all the time, right? I've been in situations where, I've invited a general support proposal from an organization, and they share a proposal for project funding instead. I think because that's what other funders are asking of them. And so I think, the fact that we're kind of working against years of other philanthropic practices and spaces in which that power has been abused by funders, it makes it all the harder to sort of work against it.
Great, thanks. I really like the naming the dynamic strategy. And finally, the final question, and going back to the beginning of the difficulties of understanding what the PO role is what would you like, what would you like people to know about the role of a PO? What would be your highlight, or your what you would like to explain, or something key that you would like to share about the role of a PO?
What I would say to someone new to philanthropy, or to my younger self as I was entering the field, is that it is an endlessly complex space that you will continuously be learning and unpacking as you go. That it's not a space where I think you can, just learn if you can just master these 5 things and enter the space, you'll be a good program officer. It's something that 17 years in, I'm still learning to do better at. And so it's a job that requires just kind of a constant openness to learning, and trying to, do it as well as you can, but operating under, a lot of uncertainty. And so it requires just a lot of constant curiosity and learning. But if you're willing to kind of put in that work, I also think there are just huge rewards in terms of the relationships you will build and the broader impact that you can achieve.
Great. Thank you very much, Dana. That was a lovely talk with you. I really enjoyed this, and I hope that you did too. And thank you to everybody listening, and tune in for our next edition of the OTT Talks.